Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar, Iis Gateway Project Legal Agreements, Facilitating Secure Data Sharing for Jurisdictions Immunization Information Systems, brought to you by the Network for Public Health Law and the American Society of Law, Medicine, and Ethics. I'm Charles Strong, the Senior Digital Marketing Coordinator at the Network's National Office, and I'll be your host for today's webinar. We strongly encourage attendee participation and would love to hear from you, so feel free to submit your questions at any time during this webinar by using the Q&A tab on the right-hand side of your screen. All you need to do is click on that tab, select all panelists from the drop-down menu, and send us your questions. We'll be addressing them during the Q&A session towards the end of today's event. Your moderator for today's webinar is Mary Beth Carrillo. Mary Beth is the Senior Director of Health Informatics at the American Immunization Registry Association. She has been involved with AIRA for over 15 years in a variety of roles, including co-chairing the Standards and Interoperability Steering Committee and the Education Steering Committee, and serving as AIRA's Board President. Mary Beth has also worked as a public health consultant and a faculty trainer with the Public Health Informatics Institute since 2013. Mary Beth will be leading us through the rest of today's webinar. So Mary Beth, over to you.
Thanks so much, Charles, and welcome everyone. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our panelists today, and then we'll cover the agenda for what we're going to be tackling as we go through this webinar. Next slide. So our first presenter is Dan Chaput. Dan is an IT specialist at the Office of the National Coordinator for Health Information Technology, part of Health and Human Services in Washington, D.C. Dan has training background and experience in public health and information technology. Having worked at the state and local health departments for many years, he also brings in a unique perspective to multiple projects and initiatives at the ONC. And Dan is on detail with HHS, and we're very happy to have him working on this project with us. Next slide. I'd like to introduce Matt Tiller, and Matt is a project manager and technical lead at ESAC Incorporated, the technology vendor for the Iis Gateway. Matt and ESAC have done extensive work to promote electronic sharing of health data. Next slide. Sally Milam is a deputy director of the network's Mid-States Region Office. Sally has practiced law for over 25 years, primarily in the health, HIPAA, and general privacy areas. She is a certified information privacy professional with U.S. and government privacy certifications. She has extensive experience in working with state agencies on data-related issues. And next slide, our final panelist is Denise Chrysler. Denise has been a public health attorney for over 30 years. She directs the Network for Public Health Law's Mid-States region. Her public health legal work includes communicable disease, environmental health, public health research, privacy, data exchange, and emergency preparedness and response. She's a member of her local Board of Health. All right, next slide. So we'll be starting off with Dan Chaput, and Dan will be giving an overview of the Iis Gateway project portfolio and the mass vaccination response. Then we'll move on to Matt, who will talk about security for the Iis Gateway project. Sally will be up next talking about legal relationships and data use agreements. And then finally, we'll hear from Denise, who will be talking about the Public Health Iis Interjurisdictional Memorandum of Understanding that allows Iis to Iis sharing. And then finally, we'll be saving about 20 minutes for questions and answers, and this is where your participation comes in. We encourage you to use that chat window and send in questions as we're going through the presentation, and then we'll use those as our jumping off point for the Q&A session. So with that, I will hand things over to Dan Chaput to get us started. And Dan, you may need to unmute your line. Dan, are you there with us?
I'm sorry, I leaned against a second mute button. I was double muted, had no idea. On the next slide, we'll jump right into this. In the beginning, when state IISs were first formed, they were all formed independently, as we can see here in the third column from the right, the State A, State B, and State C IIS. They were all formed as independent entities. Right now we have 64 IIS in state and local jurisdictions, and they all operated independently. At some point in time, electronic health records came along, and provider organizations, instead of sending faxes or calling or emails or logging in to the IIS, could send data to the state IISs directly from their EHRs. There were a number of cases where states were sharing data with each other. For example, Oregon and Washington shared data, and they would send files back and forth. In Katrina, when folks went from Louisiana to Texas, especially kids, to go into Texas school system, they needed immunization records, so Louisiana sent bulk extracts over to Texas. So as this went along and was repeating itself, it became aware that we needed to have some common way of sharing data between states, because with 64 IISs, if everyone had a point-to-point connection, in the end we're going to have 2,016 point-to-point connections. So a group of people thought up this IZ gateway to share the information. This is a piece of software that's hosted by APHL, the Association of Public Health Laboratories. So states can now connect to the gateway and share information from state to state. So once this whole right-hand side was in place, it became apparent that national provider organizations over on the top left could use their electronic health records to send data to the gateway and have them fan out to every state. So think national pharmacy chains that do immunizations, DOD, VA, Bureau of Prisons, people who, people who sit in multiple jurisdictions and need to connect to multiple IIS rather than connect to every IIS individually, can connect through the gateway. So that way, that's how they connect. On the bottom right, consumers can also access their data through consumer apps and portals, and these are all in pilot right now, and can go across multiple state IIS to get their information and have it consolidated. Likewise, there can be non-traditional vaccinators, and this is what we can be seeing now with emergency clinics or anything that might be set up as mass vaccination sites that might be stood up for COVID. So that is sort of the picture of how it all works, that this data can flow through a centralized gateway. And on the next slide, again, we first started with share, cross-jurisdictional IIS to IIS, and then we added connect to connect national providers. Then we added access to have consumers access through digital tools, and then a provider-initiated multi-jurisdictional data exchange, which just is like what it says. One query can go across multiple jurisdictions to exchange data. Next slide. Why do this? It's a common infrastructure that can be used to solve a number of use cases. It increases the availability, the completeness, and the accuracy of data across IIS. It breaks the jurisdictional boundaries down that were there in the beginning. We can rapidly onboard IIS now to support state readiness for COVID-19. And it enables exchange between IIS from federal providers, mass vaccination clinics, and access through consumer access tools. Next slide. And for COVID-19, that means that we can have a workflow that can support mass vaccination clinics, querying the IIS if more than one dose is required to make sure the patient gets the right dose, and exchange that information regardless of jurisdictional boundaries. And it importantly, down at the bottom, sets a foundation for proof or confirmation of immunization status, again, because the query of the Iis returns both your status of your immunity as well as your vaccination history. So that's really briefly the technical background and how the whole thing works together. And now I'm going to hand off to Matt, who's going to get into some real nitty-gritty details on security. Matt?
Yes, thank you, Dan. We can go to the next slide after my lovely image. So as Dan said, this is a common infrastructure, meaning all of the different projects or programs that Dan mentioned, connect, share, access, things like that, all go through a common infrastructure here. And what I'd like to do is give an overview of the technical aspects that are relevant to the security of messages and so relevant to any sort of legal considerations when signing agreements. There are two halves of messaging from the gateway, to and from the gateway. So the originating provider EHR, in this case, we're looking at an EHR messaging the gateway. It could be an Iis messaging the gateway. Initiates a connection to the gateway in the middle. And the second connection is out of the gateway to the destination Iis. Both of those are secure connections. So 1 and 4, the arrows 1 and arrow 4 represent the first TLS or secure internet connection to the gateway. And arrows 2 and 3 represent the second secure connection out of the gateway to the destination. And everything is secured by certificates, X509 certificates. So the messaging is all encrypted. Incoming to the gateway, you have to have the client that is messaging the gateway. So the EHR here in this case, messaging the gateway, has to present a specific certificate that we will give the client so that we can identify the client and authenticate them. Going out of the gateway, that's secured by the Iis certificate, as it is, that's not a special certificate, that's the certificates that they use as a standard form. We can go to the next slide. So this is a lot of text that kind of rephrases some of what I just said, but adds a little bit more detail in some places. So all Iis Gateway portfolio project components are secured at the HIPAA level, leveraging APHL security and ensuring confidentiality, integrity, and availability. APHL here, of course, being American Public Health Laboratories infrastructure. They host the gateway for us. So APHL has security aspects built into their hosting infrastructure. So some examples of how the Iis Jurisdictions information is safeguarded. As I mentioned, all connections into the Iis Gateway use an Iis Gateway digital certificate. So the Iis Gateway digital certificate is a specific certificate that the clients will get when messaging the gateway. That ensures that only authenticated systems are allowed to connect to the gateway. So we have a very, very specific list of systems that we know can connect. Outgoing connections only occur with known URLs that are configured in the gateway. This ensures that data transmission only to appropriate recipients. All immunization information is encrypted while in motion. And the gateway itself does not use, disclose, or look at the immunization information, the patient data, for the connect, share, or access projects. It's not logged in the system, it's not retained in any way, or used or looked at. The last bullet for multi-jurisdictional data exchange only, which is still under development, as it said on one of Dan's slides. The Iis Gateway has to access and decrypt some of that immunization information, such as when routing a query to the additional Iises that are identified by the sender. We have to get some of that information to create new queries, and some of the workflow requires us to do that. That's the one exception to that rule. So that's the overview of security. And now I will hand it over to Sally for her topic.
Hey, everybody. Thanks, Matt. We'll go on to the next slide. So what we'll talk about is first getting into the various trust relationships between IIS, and this presentation really is from the focus of the IIS, and then we'll talk about the various agreements. So from the IIS perspective, there are a couple of trust relationships. First, there's a trust relationship between each IIS and APHL. As Matt says, APHL hosts the gateway. So to participate in any component of the Iis Gateway project, an IIS's jurisdiction must sign the Data Use Agreement, or DUA for short, with APHL. The DUA describes the project components and sets out APHL and the IIS responsibilities. And we'll get into that more in just a little bit. Next slide, please. So most health departments are not fully covered by HIPAA, but we know that there are a few health departments that are fully covered by HIPAA, which makes the IIS also fully HIPAA covered. And APHL does offer a business associate agreement, and when a jurisdiction's IIS is covered by HIPAA and needs APHL to also sign a business associate agreement, just let us know and we will send that to you. We are happy to do that. Next slide. So in addition to the trust relationship but with a provider organization, IIS have trust relationships with all of the different provider organizations. Each jurisdiction has developed its own jurisdiction IIS-specific policy agreements, which we are calling JSPAs. IIS already have these agreements developed and in place and require providers to sign them as part of their own onboarding processes. In the very same way, the Iis Gateway will require provider organizations to sign the appropriate JSPAs to participate in Connect. A provider that connects to an IIS via the Iis Gateway is treated just like the provider that connects directly to the IIS. So if your IIS requires a certain JSPA for a provider, then the Iis Gateway will require that same JSPA regardless of the provider's location. Additionally, JSPAs will be required for each state or other jurisdiction from which the provider will receive vaccine history. Next slide. For share, there is also a trust relationship among jurisdictions. With this use case, the sharing occurs among IIS. So to participate in share, a jurisdiction must sign both the DUA with APHL and the MOU that allows exchange of immunization information across jurisdictions. The MOU is signed by all IIS jurisdictions who agree to share information with each other, and Denise Chrysler will give us more information in a little bit about the pieces of the MOU and what it covers. Next slide. So let's look at Connect. What you see in this slide is a reflection of legal relationships and not data flow. So if you look up at the top right-hand side, you see a reference to your jurisdiction's IIS. You look across the top to the left-hand side, and there's a reference to your JSPAs that you currently require provider organizations to sign. So in addition to those JSPAs, a provider organization must sign those before onboarding, as well as sign the Iis Gateway's Business Associate Agreement. And if you look over back to your IIS and the line down to the bottom with the Iis Gateway, we have reflected the Data Use Agreement that also must be signed. So to join Connect, you need to sign the Data Use Agreement with APHL and be ready to coordinate with us in getting provider organizations to sign your JSPAs. Next slide, please. For share, it's important for receiving vaccine coverage information for those who are vaccinated across jurisdictional borders. As with Connect, IIS has two trust relationships with these project components. There is one with APHL and the second one among the IIS signing jurisdictions. IIS are encouraged to begin the process of reviewing and signing the DUA and MOU to enable share. Next slide, please. So what happens in the event of a breach? And this slide shows all the players in the Iis Gateway. You'll see on the right, we have all of the different jurisdictions IIS. We have the Iis Gateway, we have provider organizations, and the various legal agreements. And through the APHL data use agreement, APHL is obligated to notify each jurisdiction promptly of a data breach. Next slide, please. So let's just take a quick walk through the data use agreement. This is an overview so that you can get comfortable with all of the different moving parts and where we need you to complete several parts of the data use agreement. So, as we already mentioned, it is required for all project components. You are signing it with the Association of Public Health Laboratories. And so when you look at the agreement, there are going to be several places where you need to insert your jurisdiction's name and contact information. Several of those places are highlighted with 2 or 3 asterisks. So please look for those and go ahead and fill that information in. The term of the project is the project duration, unless earlier terminated, and it includes successor projects. Matt has already walked through the security components within the project. APHL is obligated to provide security at that level within the data use agreement. And we called out HIPAA for you because that is the most stringent standard that state and other jurisdictions are required to meet. But you can also see that APHL holds itself to a higher level, and that is the FSMA and FedRAMP level. And those security requirements will be necessary for federal providers to connect. It's modular. You can decide to only participate in Connect, and you do that by ratifying the DUA with APHL. If you decide for your jurisdiction to participate in one or more additional project components, you'll need to complete the task order, which is within Appendix A to the data use agreement, and you want to put an X in the box of each additional project component and execute the task order in addition to the underlying data use agreement. Next slide. This is a quick summary of APHL responsibilities. They're hosting the gateway. They're responsible for accepting, routing, generating, and transforming messages as appropriate by use case. They create system users and provide appropriate access. There is support for your jurisdiction. There is mandated cybersecurity by the data use agreement and the business associate agreements. APHL sets data access and use requirements. We've already discussed the data breach notification, which standard is prompt. And there are flow down requirements within the data use agreement to ensure that all of APHL's subcontractors are held to the same level. Next slide, please. In terms of the Iis jurisdictions responsibilities, they're considerably lighter. You need to make your staff available to connect your Iis to the gateway during regular business hours. You need to work with us in terms of making sure that messages are routing properly and go through all of the different testing requirements before we get to production. Each jurisdiction is also required to obtain all required jurisdiction-specific consents before sending any information through the gateway. We have links on the slides for both the DUA and for the legal agreements overview so that you can get more information. Additionally, we have been holding weekly Q&A sessions for every week that we don't have a webinar. And so there are 2 additional Q&A sessions in the event you don't get your questions answered today. You can see that they are on September 18th and the 24th. And there is a link for additional information you can find on the website at that point. So at this point, I'll turn it over to Denise. Next slide.
Thanks, Sally. I'm going to be talking about the Public Health Iis Interjurisdictional Memorandum of Understanding, or the MOU. Next slide, please. As Stan was saying, we don't have a national Iis. We instead have Iis that developed in 64 jurisdictions independently, and yet generally when a patient is vaccinated, the information goes to the Iis where the vaccinator is located, regardless of where the individual lives. That means that the Iis and thus the provider often or may not have the information they need at the point of care to ensure full vaccination. So to address that issue, we have the MOU. Here is the URL. Sally provided it already. I'll provide it again. And the MOU is you download it, and it's a form that you fill out. Next slide, please. A little bit about the origin of the MOU. It was first developed in 2015. At that time, there were a large number of families that were moving from Colorado, Idaho, Michigan, and Minnesota. They were moving to North Dakota to work in North Dakota's oil fields. But while they moved, their immunization information was left behind in the state that they came from. So that made it really difficult to keep children current on their vaccinations and to get them enrolled in school. So Colorado, Idaho, Michigan, and Minnesota, and North Dakota, along with Wisconsin, developed an MOU to facilitate data to be shared among those 6 states so that you could have the complete vaccination history if you've got a patient who's moved between states, they're crossing borders for their care, they've been immunized while traveling, or they live in multiple states. This is the case of military, college students, migrant agricultural workers, snowbirds, and prisoners, and probably many others. It also facilitates data sharing. Dan mentioned Katrina, and people are temporarily displaced at times because of a disaster or emergency. Next slide, please. So the Iis exchange is critical, and it's especially critical when a vaccine requires multiple doses. It's anticipated that the COVID-19 vaccine will require possibly 2, but at least multiple doses. So Iis exchange is critical to the COVID vaccination efforts. By signing the MOU, you're confirming that you have the authority to do interjurisdictional exchange, and then the MOU provides the rules of the road as to what the jurisdictions have agreed to. Currently, this says 17, but since I created this slide, a few more jurisdictions have signed the MOU. I believe there's now 20, and the MOU is administered by the American Immunization Registry Association. Because we're talking about 64 jurisdictions and potentially that many jurisdictions exchanging information, it is essential that the terms that they each agree to are the same. The current version of the MOU is the 2020 version. If you go online, that's the version you will download. There were parties to the original MOU. I believe there's 5 parties left that signed the original MOU from 2015 and 2016. There's a 2019 version that just has some, we needed to update some URLs and that sort of thing, but we've drafted them in a way so that you do not need to re-sign your MOU and they work together. If you have signed the 2015 to 2016, while it's not mandatory, we would appreciate it if you would update and sign the current MOU. So the MOU is flexible. It includes all sorts of technology. You can exchange information through the Iis gateway, and then along with the MOU would need to sign the DUA. Or there are jurisdictions that may not technologically be able to connect to the gateway yet, or are in the process of it. So the MOU does allow parties to set up point-to-point exchange among themselves. It also makes certain that it does not replace any relationships that are in effect. Several IIS have had for a long time exchange relationships with other jurisdictions, and we did not want to disrupt those relationships. Next slide, please. Dan mentioned the provider-initiated multi-jurisdictional data exchange, which is a project that's under development. So this is an option that an IIS may choose in its DUA, and when a provider initiates a query, the MOU permits the Iis information to be shared among IIS to create a consolidated vaccine record. Next slide, please. Some key provisions of the MOU. So the parties to the MOU are the original parties, additional parties that sign, and future parties. To be part of the MOU, you need to provide a signed copy of the MOU to ERA. The purpose of the MOU, we drafted that so that it's clear that if you're requesting immunization information from another IIS, that you do it for the purpose of ensuring a complete and accurate immunization record, and requesting information means you need to have a relationship with the individual. The individual resides in your jurisdiction or has connections such as working in your jurisdiction, but a reason to acquire that information. I mentioned before, the MOU is not intended to eliminate current or future point-to-point agreements. The sending party is in the driver's seat, so the provision here about IIS exchange states that each sending party determines what information it provides to each receiving party based on the sending party's law and policies. Next slide, please. So there's a lot of variation among laws that govern MOUs, among laws that govern IIS. There are even jurisdictions that do not have laws that specifically apply to IIS, and they base their authority on their general laws to prevent and control disease. So it's impossible to track data where it originated when it's received by an IIS. So when an IIS receives information from a provider, the IIS incorporates that data into its IIS and handles it in accordance with its own laws and policies. And we've drafted the MOU to do the very same thing. So once the jurisdiction receives immunization information, it incorporates that information into its IIS and then treats that information in accordance with its own laws and policies. And by signing the MOU, you are representing that you have privacy and security safeguards in place. Everybody is agreeing to use their best efforts in exchanging information and exchanging accurate information. Next slide, please. So as a starting point, in signing the MOU, your attorney will be wanting to look at your legal authority to exchange immunization information across jurisdictions. As I mentioned, you may have specific laws. You may be relying on general authority. At times, it would be implementing emergency powers to exchange data, for example, during a pandemic or other other emergency. Sometimes law can read very restrictively, sometimes it's broad. And if you are having a challenge in figuring out, whether you can sign the MOU, whether it will be consistent with your own law for interjurisdictional exchange, we're happy to answer questions for you, to point out provisions in the Iis that may assist you and answer your concerns. And then, as I mentioned, or as Sally mentioned, you'd sign the DUA as well as the MOU for routing information through the Iis Gateway. And the DUA may be a place that some of your concerns that have to do with your law are answered. Next slide, please. And I'm done. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Denise, and thanks to all of our panelists today. So at this point, we will open up the question and answer part of the session. And just a reminder that you can open the Q&A panel, select all panelists, and then type in your question. We do have a few questions that came in during the presentation, and we'll go ahead and start with those, but we do encourage folks to add your questions now, and those can be for any of the panelists today. So the first question that came in is actually for, I'm guessing, Dan, and it is, you referenced FSMA and FedRAMP. Does the Iis Gateway have FedRAMP certification? If so, can you provide a link to it? Dan, can you take that one?
Sure. Hi, Thor. It's Dan again. Thor asked the question. That's part of what I'm untangling right now in terms of our authority to operate and working on our authority to operate. The AIMS platform itself, the APHL informatics messaging service in which the gateway lives, is FedRAMP certified. So I don't know the exact details of whether being in that platform we inherit FedRAMP certification, or if there's some additional piece because we have to do something to test our endpoint to make it FedRAMP certified. So unraveling all of those, I can point you to the AIMS information, and I can do that. I will do that for you. However, I'm making sure all those details are buttoned up. Great question.
Okay, excellent. Thanks so much, Dan. So more to come on that. The next question is about consent. How is compliance with consent before data transfer enforced? Is that a click here to agree and proceed button, or similar? I'll field this one, but then Sally and Denise, please jump in as well. So consent between a provider and Iis will happen just like it happens now, that obviously we have variations of consent across the Iis community based on jurisdictional law and policy. The Iis Gateway is just an intelligent router, so that will just manage the data that comes through and doesn't actually manage the consent itself. That will still be between the provider site and the Iis. And meaning that consent may be sent in that HL7 message, consent may need to be gathered in hard copy depending on what that state law says. But Sally and Denise, if you have more to say about consent, please jump in.
I think you covered it for me.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, then moving on through the questions. There is a question about HIE. Can you speak more to whether there is a requirement for an HIE a state uses for immunization data to also sign on to some form of this agreement, and how that works?
I can take that one, Mary Beth, if you like. So, yes, I've had this conversation with APHL, and they want to ensure that jurisdictions are aware and approve of the HIE connection. And for some jurisdictions, they've recommended a three-way agreement. So the data use agreement would be signed by APHL, the jurisdiction, and the HIE.
Great. Thank you, Sally. All right, next question is, can we get a copy of the slides? And I believe that the slides and the previous recording for this session, since this is number 2 out of 2 of the same sessions, are already up on the Network for Public Health Law site. But Charles, can you confirm that? Okay, I'm not hearing from Charles, and he may have stepped away. And Sally or Denise, can you confirm that? Because I'm pretty sure these are, the last session is already up, and this one will likely be loaded in the next couple days or so.
That's right.
I can confirm because I went to send somebody the URL. The slides, when I went to access them a few days ago, were up. I needed to go to a YouTube recording to actually have the audio. Charles would need to tell us whether both the recordings, so we have the audio in addition to the slides, will be on the network's website, or if we will link to the YouTube recording.
Okay, perfect. But whether it's hosted on the site itself or an external site, it sounds like both the slides and the recording will be made available through the Network for Public Health Law site.
And I'll drop a link in the chat so everyone will have access to it.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Sally. Okay, and it looks like that covers the questions that are currently in the chat box in the question and answer session now. So let me just give another minute or so for folks to come up with any additional questions, and I'll actually look in the chat box to make sure there aren't some that we're missing. It looks like folks have been answering some questions in the chat as we've been going through. So let me give folks another minute or so to prepare any questions. Okay, there is a question about identifiable information from Dan Hoppensberger. Do these data sharing agreements allow for sharing of identifiable information?
So the data sharing, oh, I'm sorry, Mary Beth.
That was Denise.
No,
go ahead, Sally.
Oh. Well, I don't want to interrupt you. Denise, go ahead.
I was just going to speak to the IIS to IIS. The information is identifiable because the IIS that needs the information to make it available to the provider is going to need to have information about the patient and the patient's vaccine history. The information in motion is in an encrypted state. So, Sally, you may have more to add to that.
No, I think you covered it.
Right, and just a reminder that the IZ Gateway does not open those messages. They just route straight through from the provider site to the IIS, and so the data then goes back again if it's a query request. The one variation I think that Matt and Dan both made reference to is the multi-jurisdictional query, and in that case there would be some information that's viewed so that multiple IIS can be queried and those data consolidated in the home IIS. But even in that instance, no data is actually saved at the IZ Gateway level. Okay, so there is a question, is there a standardized data element set for submissions? And so I will field this one, but others please jump in if you have more to mention. So we do use the HL7 version 2 messaging standard. And so it does clarify in the HL7 National Immunization Implementation Guide what data elements are requested. I will say that just as with every IIS, we encourage robust demographics to be sent for matching and deduplication purposes. And so there are some fields that are required but may be empty that we definitely encourage to be sent, but all of that is covered in the HL7 implementation guide. And then there is a more specific IZ Gateway HL7 implementation guide that will also be shortly published. It's in the final final steps of review. And that's just, it follows the national guide as well, but it's just a little bit more specific to ensure we can get consistent data across all of the participants in the IZ Gateway. So that should be released in the next couple weeks once it finishes its final review. But all of the data elements coming across are standardized. Anyone else have anything to add about the data elements question? Any of the other panelists?
Not for me.
Me either.
Okay, then we will continue moving through the questions. For Connect, is immunization data that's shared between the Iis jurisdiction and national federal providers pushed out automatically, or is data only exchanged when someone sends a message or queries the Iis's jurisdiction system? And for, well, Dan, why don't I let you field that one? And this is specifically for Connect
sure.
from providers.
So for Connect, the provider, let's say a national pharmacy chain, if a patient was to present, they, this is the proper way it should work. The provider could query the IIS to get that individual patient's record. So that it is a query based on a use case that's related to treatment. And there is, I think, I'm looking for the actual question. Yeah, there is no send there. That is a provider accessing the data. Is that, and I think that answers the question. Which question am I looking at exactly?
It's from Kirsten Lalaudis, and I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name, Kirsten.
There is no push. The question is some data pushed out automatically? There is no automatic push from the IIS out.
Okay, and just to, I think, sort of complete the answer to that question, there may be an automatic trigger on the EHR side when an immunization is saved, for example, to push to the IIS. But then if it's a query, the IIS would respond to that QBP with an RSP, so they respond to that query with a response message. So I hope that clarifies, Kirsten, and if it doesn't, please send in a follow-up question. Okay, next question is, VHA, etc. will have to complete all the items on APHL's checklist, including providing proof of a jurisdictional specific provider agreement with us before they can query data from our IIS. Will we be able to receive data from national federal providers prior to executing a JSPA, jurisdictional specific provider agreement, with them? And my understanding, I'll let Denise and Sally affirm this, but all of the agreements will need to be on file before data can move through production level feeds. But Sally and Denise, please clarify if you have a different thought about that.
No, I agree.
Denise agrees.
Okay.
And just for the question, several of them in a row are from Kristen, and I think she clarified that there was a character limit. So the bottom two are repeats of the ones above, just clarified, I believe. It's a series of messages from Kristen where she's trying to clarify what she's asking.
Okay, great, thank you. I'm scrolling down as we speak, so thank you for that, Matt. Let's see, and then there's another question in that same string. Will the CDC be onboarded as a provider on Connect? And I believe this may be referring to the Vams system, the Vaccine Administration Management System that CDC is in the process of developing right now. And there are plans to onboard Vams and the providers using Vams onto Connect via the IZ Gateway. So those data that are input into the Vams system should flow through Iis Gateway to the appropriate Iis. And then next question, do you know if jurisdictions will be able to use the Iis Gateway Connect feature to satisfy their immunization data reporting requirements? So I believe that question is related to what data elements CDC will be requesting as part of their extract from Iis for their own analytics. And that is planned to leverage the Iis Gateway, but CDC has not yet published either the CDC Iis data use agreement or the actual data elements that will be requested. And so, so I think we're waiting to see, but we understand that there are plans to use the Iis Gateway to send those data elements up to CDC. And let me just stop there and ask if any of the other panelists have anything to add there.
Mary Beth, is that optional for states or jurisdictions so that that sharing with CDC would only occur upon a jurisdiction signing CDC's data use agreement? Is that right?
I believe states would need to sign that CDC data use agreement, and I can't actually speak to whether that's optional or required. It may be a CDC requirement, but since it's not out yet, I don't know that I can speak to that piece, Sally.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Okay, and so this may be a repeat question, and I think, again, Kirsten, I think you were trying to separate these out so they were clear and also adhered to the character limit. In Connect, providers must sign a jurisdictional specific provider agreement with the jurisdiction before the jurisdiction sends them data, but can the providers send the jurisdiction data before a jurisdictionally specific provider agreement is executed? Again, my understanding is that no, that Iis and the Iis Gateway would want those agreements to be on file before data were to flow. And then, let's see, we already answered that one. Can providers connect only to Vams instead of both Vams and jurisdictional Iis for data exchange through the Iis Gateway? And my understanding, and again, I think the details of Vams are also in the process of still being finalized, but that it would likely be one or the other. So if a provider is entering in data through Vams, they would enter data through Vams and not separately unless they are already connected to data exchange with their jurisdictional Iis. So I think, I know that's a little bit of a squishy answer, but I think we're still waiting to see how Vams is going to roll out and if it will only be used for COVID vaccine. But my understanding is that the COVID vaccine would come in through Vams, and then if there's already an existing connection with that provider, that existing connection may also facilitate other vaccines being sent into their jurisdictional Iis.
Right, that's an excellent question. It's an excellent question because, I mean, I have some outstanding questions also, like if a site is using Vams, will they only administer COVID-19? Or if a patient presents who also needs their flu vaccine, can you get your flu at the same time as COVID-19? So, I mean, it seems like a reasonable thing that you might ask. So that's unclear. And as far as providers connecting to Vams and the gateway, providers don't that would only be a national provider who was connected to the gateway for immunizing. Typically, other providers like hospitals, doctors' offices, clinics, whatever, would be connected directly to their state Iis. So, and from what I've read in the, and anyone can in the things that have been published and distributed to states, and again, please feel free to correct me, is that, you know, if the Iis is connected to share and connect, that, the, you know, or an EHR, is connected to an IIS that's connected to Share and Connect, there's no reason to use Vams. So, but that is all, it is all waiting on final clarification on Vams deployment.
Yeah, and I would strongly recommend, if you have questions about Vams, to send those to isinfo@cdc.gov, and I'll send that out through the chat window too, because that is the question repository for all things Vams, and CDC is managing those questions. So I will send that out through the chat window if additional questions come up about Vams specifically.
There is also a weekly news brief that comes out that is worth being subscribed to. Would you have the link where folks can get the weekly news brief? I think that would be.
Sure, I'll send that out as well. And that's the Iis information brief that comes from CDC. And there is information about how to subscribe to that. So we'll go ahead and get that out through the chat window as well. Okay, and I think that concludes the questions in the Q&A section. I will mention that someone asked in the chat window, could you send me the JSPA? And I just want to remind folks that that's going to be specific for every jurisdiction, that that is what the jurisdiction itself uses, which may be a provider agreement, it may be a user agreement, it may be a confidentiality agreement. But that will be jurisdiction specific. So that's not something that the IZ Gateway team necessarily creates in any way. We just support jurisdictions to develop their own jurisdictional specific agreements and can help facilitate getting those signed.
I actually have
and I just pulled, go ahead, Dan.
I have a quick question for Matt Tiller that might help clarify some of the earlier questions on FedRAMP certification. Matt, can you briefly describe the gateway and its relationship to the APHL AIMS platform?
Yes.
From a technical viewpoint.
Right. So me and my company are developing a web application that is deployed to a web server, just a Tomcat web server, very common. That web server is hosted at APHL's AIMS infrastructure that Dan mentioned, some of the security details around that. So all of the aspects, all of these security related aspects that APHL provides with their AIMS platform are automatically given to what we're deploying and managing within their system. Is that what you're trying to get at, Dan?
Yes. And then in addition, the piece that isn't covered there is the fact that you do have endpoints that are exposed.
Yes.
Outside of AIMS? Yeah.
It's a SOAP web service, right? So there are endpoints to send the message to the gateway that are over the public internet. However, it's encrypted with certificates, as all most standard internet traffic is today. And we have, as I mentioned, a specific set of people that we know can query us because we gave them certificates to do so. The client contacting the server has to present its certificate to the gateway. So it's bidirectional TLS. And going out, the gateway going out only messages the URLs that we know are IISs. We specifically configure those individually so that it can only message a certain list of IIS participants.
Okay,
Great. Thank you, Matt.
Sorry. Thank you, Matt. And I just sent out in the chat window the updated procedure for subscribing to the Iis information brief. And this typically comes out every Friday from CDC and has a wealth of information in it. So we encourage folks to sign up for that to stay up to date on all things CDC and immunization related. Okay, and then I see another question, and we'll briefly touch on this and then we'll wrap up. Can you please clarify when you said an EHR trigger can be set up to push data to IZ Gateway, or only a trigger to allow an EHR to push data if there is query in the data? And I believe that is both, that an EHR trigger can send data to an Iis for submission as well as a query. Okay, and we will stop there and I'll hand it back to Charles to wrap us up.
Thanks, Mary Beth, and thank you everyone for your participation in today's webinar, and thank you for our panelists for presenting today. Just a few final notes to all of our attendees. You will be receiving an email from the network with the video playback of this webinar, as well as a link to our brief webinar survey. The survey takes just 1 minute to fill out and provides us with some really great insights, especially in regards to what topics you might be interested in for future webinars. You'll also be receiving an email from ASL with information on how to apply for CLE credits for this event. Finally, join us next week for the virtual summit on COVID-19 response and recovery. Registration is free and you can sign up at networkforphl.org/summit. That concludes today's webinar. Thank you all for attending and have a great rest of your day.